Huge pleasure to be here with Marcus today to explore the unknowable, the strange frontiers in mathematics and science. And I suppose the one place to start off with, Marcus, is you've inherited this amazing chair, the Simonyi chair for public understanding of science from the old era when we talked about PUS and not PES. Now we talk about public engagement. Of course, the last holder of that chair was Richard Dawkins. So are you Dawkins 2.0? You're going to sock it to these religious types today.
It's so interesting because, of course, when I took over from Richard, a lot of journalists got in contact about, where the direction of this chair was going to go. And I think the first question I always got asked by journalists was, do you believe in God? Are you a religious man? And so I was, in a way, the professorship, I think Richard, by writing the God Delusion, the professorship got a little bit confused about, it somehow became a professorship for atheism rather than for science. And so I was quite keen when I took over from Richard to take it back to really, fundamentally talking about science. So, but I had this kind of trick to bat away these journalists, who wanted to know, am I going to be peddling the atheist message, and so I said, no, I'm a deeply religious man. And they were a little bit shocked by, oh God. I said, yes, but my religion happens to be the Arsenal Football Club. Actually, it was very, in organising our session.
This is today, a huge disappointment to me because I'm a Spurs supporter.
Yes. You must be hugely disappointed at the moment because you're facing relegation. But I don't want to rub that in. But,
thank you.
Yes, but
it was all going so well.
Yes, in fact, to organise this session, I was a real troublemaker because I kept on having to say, well, we're playing Everton some point at this weekend, but I'm not quite sure when, so you have to schedule my session. But anyway, it was a sort of a rather flippant way of batting. But actually, to say that, I think actually football does play quite a significant role in society, almost like a religious faith. I mean, I go to my temple, which happens to be the Emirates Stadium. I sing songs to my idols, which, Odegaard and Saka. And I have faith that Arsenal will win the Premiership this season, and my faith is constantly tested. In fact, I don't want to rub this in, but we celebrated St. Totteringham Day. St. Totteringham Day is the day when Spurs have no chance mathematically to overtake Arsenal in the league. And we celebrated it so early this year. It was last weekend that you were so bad.
I'm afraid I've got another appointment now, actually, Marcus. I've got to leave.
But it was kind of interesting because I did sort of, try to push away from faith. But it keeps on coming up because I think actually, in some ways, science and religion are both interested in the very big questions. But I think what got me on to thinking about the connections rather than the differences was I was on a radio show in Ireland. It was a live show about philosophy and religion. I said, I'm happy to talk about philosophy, but I don't really want to go down the religion route. The little light went red live, and the first question is asked, so Marcus, do you believe in God? Sorry, that was a terrible Irish accent. But and I got, oh gosh, I now have to engage with this kind of, and I said, well, can you define, mathematicians and scientists, if we're going to say whether we believe in something or not, we want quite a clear definition of what it is we think we're going to. And he said, well, it's something which transcends understanding, which at first I thought was a big cop-out. But actually, as I began to think about it, I thought that was a very interesting definition and related to science. Science somehow, as scientists, we believe we could know everything, but there are surely things which will always remain beyond the ability of science to know.
I mean, as a bit of background to this, if you talk to, Einstein famously said that religion and science are orthogonal, so they don't really overlap at all. They're at cross purposes. But of course, we've had loads of people like Lemaitre and Polkinghorne and others, very eminent scientists who are very religious as well. So just unpack that.
Yes, but I think I actually I did my postdoc at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and I worked with somebody who I realized was a brother in mathematics. But when I went to work with him, I discovered he was a very religious Orthodox Jew settler in the West Bank, both religiously and politically, kind of very in different directions. And I used to push him on how do you work these things together? Your belief that the universe is only a certain 5,000 years old or whatever, and your mathematical side. And he really had a split personality on it. But I think I wrote this book called What We Cannot Know, which is about this sort of connections between, the challenge of where does science run out, and you have to perhaps go somewhere else. But I was quite surprised at how many religious scientists I did encounter. I think there are those. There's a really interesting difference between the theist and the deist. The deist sort of believes that the idea of a god that might kick all of this off, but then there are rules which run the universe, right. And I'm interested in understanding theirs, and this god that they believe in does not intervene. And I think that's, in a way, that's all about God as something that we cannot know. It's about, I don't know where all of this stuff came from. I'm going to put a placeholder as a God, but once all of this has got going, Big Bang, rules of science, then I'm interested in discovering that. So I think Einstein...
So God's role is kind of contracting as a scientific enterprise.
Well, it's a sort of placeholder for something that I don't know.
Right,
but
right.
I think Einstein, when he talked about God, was using it in a kind of in a deist way, but I think the more interesting one is the theist way. So, for example, John Polkinghorne, who was one of the great quantum physicists in his early years, who then actually went off and became a priest in the Church of England, when I talked to him and interviewed him for the book, he is a theist. He believes his God intervenes in the world. And I was like, okay, how does that work scientifically? Yeah. And that's the other one is John Barrow, who's a cosmologist. And I think it's interesting which scientists have connections with religion, because cosmology is a sort of interesting place where you can't do any experiments. There's just this one universe, and you basically can't do tests on it, so you just have to observe. And so cosmology tends to be somewhere where you get quite a lot of religious scientists being found.
But one key thing for the audience, though, is that there's a difference between the unknown and the unknowable. I mean, just unpack that a bit, because they lead us in fundamentally different directions.
Yeah, I quite like the Donald Rumsfeld quote about, there's the known knowns, the known unknowns, the unknown unknowns. And I think, of course, there are lots of things we don't know at the moment in science. We don't know quite what dark matter is, dark energy. But I think those aren't things that...
just for the audience, only 5% of the universe is the stuff that things are made of. The other 95%
What is that? We don't know.
We don't know. Of course, the physicists have been really cunning. They've rebranded ignorance as dark matter and dark energy, but they don't know what they're talking about.
No, but I do think that is something that we will discover, you see. So I don't think there's something intrinsically unknowable about. So I think those are things which we know could become known, and there are tons of those. And in mathematics as well, we have. But what I was interested in this book was actually the things that will. Are there questions of science that will always remain unanswerable? Maybe there aren't, but that would be very strange. Yeah. I don't. It'd be very anti-Copernican, because the universe hasn't been set up as an exercise in the theory of knowledge. There must be some things that by their nature will be beyond us, and so the book sort of explores some of those. And for example, is the universe infinite? Well, if it is infinite? There's a real limit to whether we could ever know that, because Einstein showed that information travels no faster than the speed of light. It means that there is a cosmic horizon, a kind of bubble of knowledge beyond which no information can reach us. That is expanding as time goes on, but weirdly, because the universe is accelerating in its expansion, more things are being pushed over this boundary than we are seeing. So we're actually losing information. We will get to a point actually in the future where all of the galaxies other than our own will have been pushed over this horizon. We will not be able to see them. If we'd evolved as a species at that point in the future, we would basically have a model of our universe as our galaxy and a void beyond that. We wouldn't be able to know about those galaxies. So knowing whether the universe is infinite might be a question that by its nature, we will never be able to answer.
So those limits, those horizons, that's, where there is a kind of shared encounter with the unknown between science and religion. And that's what you're looking at with this book, basically.
Yes, I mean, I think, if we can identify some questions which are by their nature unknowable to us as humans, or unknowable just what do they represent then? I mean, do they represent a place where you then have the option of making a choice about what the answer, if either answer is possible, then maybe it's acceptable, and maybe that is an element of faith and saying, okay, well, you will never be able to prove to me that I'm wrong, and I now have a choice about which one I want to believe in. So, that was what I was interested in, whether those unknowables,
right,
therefore, are things where you can sort of make a choice about what you believe in.
So let's just start off with an easy example, and then we're going to go on to the hideously mathematical ones and blow your minds. But, chaos theory showed us the limits of weather prediction, and Ed Lorenz in the 60s famously had this primitive model of the atmosphere, computer model. He repeated his experiment and found he got completely different results. And it turns out he'd rounded the numbers he fed into his equations. And the butterfly effect that everyone's familiar with is basically saying, unless you feed numbers into your equations with infinite precision, there's going to be a limit to, you're going to start off with similar behavior, but if you start rounding numbers and so on, they're going to drift away from reality. But they're still within a kind of an envelope of possibilities, aren't they? So it's not completely random madness, but...
No, not at all. It's not random at all. I mean,
it's highly ordered
yes, in fact,
yes.
What's very interesting is that, post-Newton, we believed we lived in a deterministic universe, where basically if you knew, and this is what Laplace said, if we knew how the universe is set up, exactly where everything is, we know the equations of motion, we can just run those equations and know the future. And that was, what we sort of believed up to the quantum age. And actually, but chaos theory revealed, even if that is true, there will be unknowables, because we can never know the complete setup of the present, where every particle is, how it's moving, and even an approximation can lead to huge divergence in predictions. So I think this is a limit. We can, although let's be pre-quantum, if we are living in a deterministic universe, it's still an unknowable universe because of the effect of chaos theory. Now, what's interesting is, I sort of challenged John Polkinghorne, this quantum physicist who became a religious. He liked to talk of himself as a sort of vegetarian butcher, that he become a scientist that had become a priest. But he is a theist who believes that his God acts in the world to change things. And I really wanted to challenge him. Okay, well, how does that work scientifically? How is this thing that you believe in? And I thought he might choose quantum physics, because quantum physics is interesting because it is a belief in there is true randomness in our universe, that if you set a quantum experiment up and you run it and something happens, if you set it up exactly the same again, then the randomness of quantum physics means it can have a completely different answer. So that introduces a very different sort of element to physics. And I wonder whether he would use the fact that every time we observe an experiment, there's nothing which determines whether it goes kind of left or right. Or if you have a pot of uranium, there's nothing in modern scientific theory which says when it's going to radiate. Maybe that's a place where Polkinghorne might think that a god can intervene as sort of controlling that as a kind of external force. But he chose chaos theory as his place where he feels that in those kind of unknowables about how things can be set up, that's where a god could sort of tinker and send things off in a different direction. And interestingly, that's also how Newton believed. Newton was a theist, and that's how he believed that his God intervened.
Well, let's move on to, what I find amazing is that maths itself, the structure of maths itself, is not as straightforward and deterministic as we might expect. And in the book, you talk about the continuum hypothesis as a kind of turning point in your understanding of this. Now, be gentle with them, but just give us a sense of the continuum hypothesis.
Well, I'm going to go back a little bit before that. It's related, but to Gödel's incompleteness theory.
Okay, right.
Which is
equally head.
Yeah, which is
really.
Yes, it does mess with you. But what is interesting is that I think the ancient Greeks gave us this impression that every truth of mathematics we will ultimately be able to prove the truth of a statement about numbers, for example. And I think that's what everyone had grown up with into the beginning of the 20th century. But then Kurt Gödel, this Austrian logician...
In fact, at that time, everyone just thought you could just build all of mathematics from bricks of pure logic.
Yeah, absolutely.
You'd answer anything.
Yeah, and that any truth, you would be able to eventually find some way to realize that truth. But then Gödel showed that within any system for mathematics, there will always be true statements which you can't prove are true within that system. Sort of by working outside the system, you can know the truth of the statement, but when you're stuck within it, Gödel showed that there's a difference between truth and proof, which I think is deeply sort of exciting in a way, that there will be things that, mathematics is able to prove, turn in on itself, use mathematics to prove that there will be things within a system that you cannot know.
In fact, what I love is you mentioned John Barrow, and I must pull out the famous John Barrow quote. He said, he cites Gödel and argues that if religion is defined to be a system of ideas that contains unprovable statements, then Gödel taught us that maths is not only a religion, it's the only religion that can prove itself to be one. That's rather spectacular.
Yeah, I think it is spectacular. It's one of the greatest theorems that was proved sort of in the 20th century to show that limitation. But I think there's an important point here, which is about being stuck inside a system. So, and very often these unknowables are about those limits. For example, our universe, physics now has proposed that there are other universes with other laws of physics, but because we're stuck within our universe, is that science if we're sort of speculating about other universes which we could never test are true? So I think, and consciousness is another one I talk about in the book. Consciousness, the hard problem of consciousness is the fact that our consciousness by its nature is closed within our own system. And
I think consciousness also is tricky because there isn't really a scientific definition of what we're talking about, and the same happens with intelligence. So we talk about artificial intelligence, not quite sure what we're talking about there, or even life itself. And that kind of makes it even harder and slipperier, doesn't it?
Yes, but consciousness is sort of something that, as Descartes said, is basically the only thing I am certain about is my own consciousness. But what I can't be certain of is, about whether all of you are conscious. I mean, that I can't
They
get inside
look pretty
that.
bright-eyed to me, actually.
Well, actually, I think they look a bit zombified on this Saturday morning. So whether there is consciousness going, but it is something that I cut. But because we are stuck within a system, it's very hard. And actually, I think that's what art and culture is our best tool to try and understand the. But let me come now to the continuum hypothesis, because this is a statement within mathematics, which both Gödel and Paul Cohen were able to show is an example of within our current system that we use for mathematics, is an example of a statement which we cannot prove is true within this. But not only that, you can I'm going to say what it is in a minute, but basically this is a statement that you can either assume is true within your system, and you can work very happily within that mathematics where you believe the continuum hypothesis is true, or you can assume that it's false and work within an equally consistent system, doesn't collapse, but they are two very different systems, and as a mathematician I can choose which one I want to work in. Now, the continuum hypothesis is about the concept of infinity. So infinity used to be one of those things that we sort of was a placeholder for things we don't understand, but actually George Cantor at the end of the 19th century actually showed that infinity is something that we can understand, that there are many different sorts of infinity. The smallest infinity, so I'm going to slightly maybe blow your minds, but I think for me,
Buckle up, everyone.
This was the most exciting thing I discovered when I was training to be a mathematician. There are different sizes of infinity. So they're already laughing at the uncomfortable laughter is a response to being uncomfortable. What? So the smallest one is our counting numbers: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But there's a larger. Well, so you might say, okay, well, what about fractions? Fractions turns out to looks larger because between 1 and 2 there are infinitely many fractions. But actually, George Cantor showed that the infinity of fractions, that actually you can list them in a list and count them. So they are also a small infinity. But the larger infinity is the infinity of all infinite decimal numbers. In fact, we're celebrating today Pi Day because it's March 14th, which is 3.14.
The whole audience has been going crazy all morning. Come on, let's give it up for Pi Day.
Hooray! Yeah, but pi is an example of one of these infinite decimal numbers, 3.14159. That's as far as I can go. But there are, so we have infinitely many infinite decimal numbers, and George Cantor proved that this infinity is genuinely larger, that you can't count these numbers, that they don't match up to the whole numbers. Now, the continuum hypothesis is the question: is there an infinity between the smallest one and the set of infinite decimal numbers? And mathematicians thought, either there is or there isn't. Either there's a set of numbers which is genuinely bigger than the counting numbers but genuinely smaller than the infinite decimal ones, or there isn't. And what Gödel and Paul Cohen showed is actually you can decide which one you want to be true. Now, this I think is interesting because I think faith is about a decision about something you want to admit, a statement into your world view that you want to believe in. And so as a mathematician,
they're choosing. That's getting a bit towards faith. I have faith that this is the way to do it, not that.
Yes, the interesting thing is mathematicians often work within both. So they might say, today I'm going to believe that the continuum hypothesis is true, or today I'm going to believe it's false. Now, I had a conversion on the road to Damascus moment, which is I got rather obsessed with this. Because I think I'm pretty much, as a scientist, I think we're quite often reductionists at heart. Yeah. We like to build things up, and we don't want to put something in which really is unnecessary. Yeah. I think we work very much under the kind of philosophical idea of abduction, which is moving to the simplest explanation that you can come up with. And why on earth would you put in an extra hypothesis like the existence of God? I can't remember, was it Leibniz or... So there was one mathematician who said, somebody asked him about whether he believed in God. I don't need that assumption to make things work. So I think that scientists, we very often... And that's why Dawkins very often says, believing in God is like believing in a teapot orbiting round Earth, which you could never know about. You can't. Why would you want to introduce that as an extra hypothesis? So I think that very often I will only admit things into my world view which are absolutely necessary, and I won't admit something which just seems extra to it. But I think I changed my mind, and I read, I've got very obsessed with this French philosopher called Alain Badiou, and he got very much, I was quite interested in because he does a lot of mathematics, and I was wondering, is he just bullshitting?
He's not one of those easy reader.
Oh, he's not an easy read at all. No, his volumes are like this. But I was always worried that he was using mathematics as a kind of cover to bamboozle philosophers, and they all go, oh, he seems really intelligent because he's talking maths. And so I spent a lot of time reading him, and I was really fascinated that he basically said, look, here's an example where you can choose what you want to be true. And if you choose the fact that there is no infinity between these two, that's a kind of reductionist approach. That was what Gödel kind of went for. Don't admit anything which you can't really prove is there. Now, I can't prove, that's the point. We've proved that you can't prove this thing is there or not. You've just got to make just got to decide, do you want to admit that or not? Now, then if Paul Cohen proved that you could admit this infinite set and work within that. And I suddenly thought, oh, it's so much more exciting to work in that mathematics where there is an infinite set in between those. It's richer, but I have to, it's almost an act of faith that I want to work within the kind of more interesting one. And that made me think, well, gosh, if I do that in my mathematics, why am I not doing that in other areas of my life where I might admit something that is unnecessary, unprovable, but why would I not? And I just wonder whether people who, introduce the idea of a God into their lives, is that a similar act to me thinking, well, actually, I prefer to work within a mathematics where there is an infinite set between. So it's sort of it was a really interesting challenge to me, because before I'd sort of did this, why admit the idea of a God when it's unnecessary?
But one sort of naive question to ask you, which is you get this sense with Gödel that you've set up this logic system and there are unprovable things within that logic system. But then if you extend it, you might be able to crack that. Now, surely if you're extending your logic system, you can crack this continuum problem and find out which one is right and which one's wrong.
No, but I think this is absolutely the point, because what you can do is, if there is an axiom which it doesn't matter whether you take it on as true or not, you can take it in as another axiom to your system and it becomes true just because it's a fundamental axiom. So this is any unprovable statement you can introduce into the system and expand it. But Gödel's theorem is so brilliant that it shows however much you expand it, there'll always be another unknowable sentence, and so it's turtles all the way down. Or, but I think that's the point. Do you want to admit this and work within a mathematics where you are now introducing that as I think axioms. The whole setup of mathematics is kind of interesting because I have axioms about how I think numbers work, and is that an act of faith to say, okay,
well,
I'm going to admit those? Yeah,
Marcus, there's kind of an assumption to our whole conversation, which is that the universe is mathematical. And, there was the famous Eugene Wigner lecture about the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics. Why should the universe follow logical rules? So you are actually quite religious, really. You believe in maths.
I believe in, yes, and I think... yes, we want to let's end on this because
let's end on that and then we'll have some questions.
Yeah, because, I think you find so much mathematics just all the way through nature, the way the universe works. It just seems to be so much mathematics there. And a lot of people say that if there is a God, that God is definitely a mathematician. Now, I would reverse that because, often God is a placeholder for why is there something rather than nothing. Where did all of this stuff come from? That's a very good question. Why is there stuff rather than no stuff? And I think that the universe we see around us is so mathematical because we are a physicalized piece of mathematics. The mathematics, often if you're looking for a creator, I mean, when I talk to my kids about God, they said, "Oh, yeah, but who created God?" You know, it's sort of like, and go in this infinite regress. And I think it's a fair point that you need, if you're going to have something which is an initiator, you need, or a creator, you need something which doesn't need its own creation. You need something which is outside of time. And I think mathematics is something which doesn't need a moment of creation.
Yep.
There are moments of discovery, and those are moments in time. But mathematical structures, I mean, mathematics is the study of structure, and those structures exist outside of time. And my feeling is that the reason we're seeing so much mathematics around us is that we are a physicalized piece of mathematics. So the God you're after, I believe, is mathematics. Mathematics is the reason there is something rather than nothing.